Welcome! This video is the first two sections of my Godot beginner course, which is available on Udemy. If you want to learn how to make games with the Godot game engine, make sure to check it out. There's a link in the description. Hi there! In this lecture, we will download and set up Godot. Godot is very lightweight, so luckily, this is going to be very simple. Let's get into it. Okay, go to godotengine.org and click on download here. Then select your operating system. Mine is Windows. And depending on your system, either select 64 or 32-bit version of Godot. Make sure you're downloading the standard version. The mono version is for C#, but in this course we're going to be using GDScript. If you don't know what bit your system is, you can go to open up the start menu, type in about and click on about your PC. And in here next to system type, you can see if your system is 64 or 32-bit. Mine is 64, so I'm gonna click on 64 and the installation will start. Let's go inside my download folder and wait. Here it is. It's only 27 megabytes. It's very small and lightweight. It's one of the perks of Godot. I'm gonna extract this using 7-zip. And this exe file is all you need to run Godot. Double click and Godot will start. Let's close this and you can leave it here if you want to, but I usually move this to a location where I can easily access it. I have a folder called Godot builds inside my main drive. And in here, I store the different versions of Godot that I downloaded through time. As you can see, I have 5 different versions here, and I usually start deleting the versions that get too old. So the version we're going to use is 3.2.3, which I have here, so I'm not going to move it here. But if you want to, you can create a folder structure like this to store your different versions of Godot. Awesome, let's get into the next video. Hey, in this lecture, we will take a look at the project manager and learn how to create a new project. Let's get started. The first time you open up Godot, you're gonna see the project manager. We can do lots of things from here. All the projects that you create will be listed here. And as you can see, I have tons of projects that I previously worked on, but since this is your first time, this list is going to be empty for you. Now let's take a look at these buttons on the right side. We can create a new project by clicking on this button. We can import a single project by locating it on our drive. We can also scan a folder to import multiple projects, which is very useful if you have, let's say, 5, 10 projects in a folder that you want to import into your list here. Let's click on a project, and that way we can get more options here. We can click on Edit, which will open this project on the editor. We can click on Run, which will run the game and not necessarily open it up in the editor. We can rename a project. We can also remove a project. Keep in mind, this remove isn't gonna delete the files from your system. It's only gonna delete it from this list. So you're not gonna be able to see it inside the project manager, but you will keep the files inside your system. This is very useful if you have some projects that you made, but they were kind of practice projects and you don't really need them anymore, but you don't want to delete them. So you can click on remove to remove them from this list, but you get to keep the files. We also have a template section on the top left. And from here, you can download all sorts of pre-made projects from the Godot asset library, which is very useful. For example, you might want to learn how to make an RTS game in Godot. You can just type RTS, hit search, and you'll surely get some results. See RTS mouse selection and nav mesh move. I can download this project by clicking on it, press download, and it's gonna download it for me. And when it's done, I can click on install and install it to my system and look inside the files, look how this person made this project and learn from it. Great, let's go back to projects. And in here, let's create a new project. Let's first name it. We're gonna call this one Learning Godot. And I'm gonna pick a path to store my project. And the way I have this set up is I have a projects folder in which I store projects for different kinds of softwares. And inside here, I have a Godot project folder. And in here, I store all my Godot projects. I'm gonna select this folder and I'm gonna create a folder inside of here by clicking this button. And that's gonna create a folder by the same name. We can also specify a renderer. Now, at this point, you don't really need to think too much about the renderer, but just know that 3.0, OpenGL 3.0 has more features than 2.0, but not all mobile devices support 3.0. And so if you're making a mobile game or a web game, which it specifies here, you might want to use 2.0. We're going to use 3.0 and click on Create and Edit. And this will create a new project and open it up inside the Godot editor. Great, let's move on to the next video. Hi there. This section is an introduction to the Godot's editor. The editor is what comes up after you launch a project from the project manager, and it is where you will be spending most of your time when you're making games with Godot. When I say Godot, I'm referring to the Godot's editor, so I'm going to be using those words interchangeably. I might say Godot, I might say the editor, I might say Godot's editor. It means the same thing. Keep in mind that this section isn't meant to be a comprehensive look into what each part does, but it's more like an overview. I want you to get a basic understanding of what each section of the editor does. With that in mind, let's get into the next lecture. In this lecture, we're gonna take a look at the main menus. These are used for extremely useful operations in Godot. So let's get started. Okay, the main menus are located on the top left. The first one we're gonna look into is the scene menu. This lets us create a new scene, open up a previous scene that we created, or things like saving a scene, quick open scenes. Basically, this menu lets us manipulate scenes. Scenes are, you can think of them as a level of your game. We're going to be taking a much deeper look at scenes in the upcoming lectures. But yes, this menu is used for manipulating scenes. Next, we have the project menu. This one has the project settings in it, which we're going to learn lots about. Let's take a look at it. By default, you should be on the General tab. And in here, you have all sorts of different settings to configure your project. We're not going to be taking a look at what each one of these does, but I encourage you to just go through each one of these and try to maybe guess what they do or try to get an understanding of what they do. Here we have config under application. From here you can give a name to your project. You can set an icon. Let's scroll a bit down. Here we have window under display. From here you can set a window size for your game. You can make it so that it's resizable or not. Very, very awesome stuff. In here we also have input map. From here you can set custom input actions. We're going to be using this in the future. For example, we have UI accept here, and this action will be fired when you press your enter key or your space key. You can add more keys from here, or you can add controller buttons, controller axes, and mouse buttons. We have localization. This is for translating your game to different languages. Auto load, which is for singletons. We have plugins if you want to use plugins, and GD native, and this is for using C++ in your game. Let's close this. What else do we have inside the project settings? We have export. We're going to use this export option and we're going to export our games. You can also quit to the project list from here. Next, we have the debug menu, and this has some useful options for debugging our game. Editor menu has the editor settings. Much like the project settings, this is also very useful. Let's go to general. Keep in mind, project settings is different for each project. So all the configurations you do inside the project settings will be gone if you create a new project. It's project specific. That's why it's called project settings. But editor settings is for customizing your editor. So these settings will carry on to every project that you create. From here you can, let's take a look at editor. From here you can set a different language. You can change your font size. All sorts of different options here that you can play around with. Again, take a look at these, play around, experiment. That's how you learn. I remember when I first started learning Godot, I went through all of these settings and I just played around, just changed them and see what happened. We also have a shortcuts tab here, and this lists a ton of shortcuts that you can use in Godot. These are very useful and these will make your life much easier. I'm gonna teach you some of these shortcuts as we move along in the course and as we learn more things, but take a look at these and see if you can find some shortcuts that you can use. You're not going to be able to find too much value in here because you're just starting out, but come back to here once you have more knowledge of Godot and try to see if you can find some useful shortcuts to make your life easier. Awesome. And inside the editor menu, you can also do cool stuff like taking a screenshot, toggle full screen, and else. Finally, we have the help menu. From here, Godot links you to a few useful websites like the online documentation, the Q&A section. You can report a bug, you can send feedback. You also have an about window that tells you information about your specific version of Godot and who's working on Godot, the project manager, developers, etc. Awesome. This was a quick look to the main menus of Godot. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome. In this lecture, we're gonna learn about viewports and workspaces in Godot. When you look at Godot, the viewport is the elephant in the room. It covers the most screen real estate, and likewise, it's very important. Think of a viewport as a screen onto which the game is projected. In order to see the game, we need to have a surface to draw the game. That surface is the viewport. Now, that's a complicated explanation. Basically, the viewport shows you what's inside your game. In Godot, your game is made out of scenes, and scenes are made out of nodes. The viewport will show you what's inside the active scene. The scene that you have selected will be displayed here, up top. Much like a web browser has tabs, Godot will have different tabs of different scenes here, which you can switch between, and the one that you have selected will be displayed inside the viewport. You can think of scenes as a level or like a part of your game, and scenes are made out of nodes, and nodes are the basic building blocks of Godot. Most things that you'll create in Godot will be done by creating different kinds of nodes. We have nodes for displaying 2D images, that's the sprite node. We have a node for creating animations, the animation player node. We're going to be diving much deeper to scenes and nodes in an upcoming section. By default, Godot shows you the 3D viewport. You can switch between 3D and 2D from the workspaces. The workspaces are located up top in the center here. We have 2D, 3D, script, and asset library. 2D is for 2D games, which is where we'll spend almost all of our time. 3D is for 3D games. Script is Godot's built-in code editor. And asset library is a place where you can download different types of assets from Godot. Let's take a look at 2D. I'm going to click on it. And this takes me to the 2D workspace. Let's also take a look at the script workspace. We don't have much here right now because we didn't create any scripts in this project, but in the future, we're going to be using this a lot. Don't worry. I'm going to go back to the 2D workspace. You can also use the shortcuts, which is F1 for 2D, F2 for 3D, and F3 for the script editor. In here, just to demonstrate, I'm gonna drag this icon.png I have inside my file system inside the viewport, and I'm gonna let it go. And as you can see, I have a sprite in my game and I can see it on the viewport. As you might have noticed, I now have a node in my scene here under my scene tab. I'm going to explain the scene tab in an upcoming lecture. I did this just to demonstrate to you that the viewport shows us what's inside our game. In this specific location, I have a sprite and I can see it from here. Awesome. I'm going to delete this node by right-clicking on it and clicking on delete node. This was viewports and workspaces. Thank you for watching, and let's move on to the next lecture. This lecture is about the Scene tab and the Inspector tab. These two are closely related, and that's why I decided to introduce them together. Let's get started. First, let's take a look at the Scene tab. The Scene tab lists the content of the active scene. So in Godot, a game is made out of scenes, and a scene is made out of nodes. And all the nodes that are inside a certain scene, the active scene in this case, will be displayed here. Let's add a basic node to our scene. I'm gonna click on this plus sign to add a new node, and this is gonna open the Create New Node window. And from here we can do a search if we want to, or we can just select a node from here to add to our scene. I'm gonna click on node, which is the most basic node that you can use in Godot. I'm gonna click on create, and this will add a basic node to my scene. In Godot, every scene needs a root node. The first node you add will be the root node. Everything else you add after will be the child of the root node. So now if I add one more node to my scene, this will be its child, and you can see that by the way it's indented here. Let's delete this because we don't need it. Okay, now we have a scene. We have a basic node inside of our scene. Now let's save this scene. To save my scene, I'm gonna go to the scene menu and I'm gonna click on save scene. You can also use the Ctrl+S shortcut. Let's save it inside the res folder, and we don't need to change its name. And let's click on save. And we have our first scene saved into our file system. Awesome. You can see your saved scene file inside the file system here. And if this is closed down for some reason, you can double click here on this node.tscn file to open up your scene. Now let's talk about the inspector. Well, right now we can't see anything inside the inspector, and that's because the inspector gives us information about what we have selected. It's not only for nodes, but for the most part we're going to use it to manage the properties of different types of nodes. Let's click on the node here we have inside our scene, and that way we can see some information inside the inspector. This basic node only has the node class in it, so that's why we only get a pause and a script property here. Let's try adding a more complicated node to our scene. Click on the plus sign, or you can use the shortcut, which is Ctrl+A, and add a node 2D to your scene. This is much similar to the basic node that we added earlier, but this one has a 2D transform inside of it. Let's take a look at the inspector, and as you can see, this one has a node 2D property here, which has a transform and a z index. This node also inherits from the canvas item and the basic node type that we saw earlier. In Godot, nodes inherit from each other, so this node 2D inherits from the canvas item and also the basic node type. From the basic node type, this node gets the pause and the script properties, and from the canvas item, it gets the visibility and the material properties. And from its own class, the node 2D, it has a transform which we can customize. We can manage to set a different position, a rotation, and a scale. And it also has a z index. Great. Now let's add a new node, and this is going to be a sprite node. Now, right now I have the node 2D selected in my scene tab. If I add a new node now, it's going to be a child of the node I have selected. But I don't want my sprite to be a child of this node 2D. I want it to be a child of the root node, which is the basic node. That's why I'm going to click on the root node, and then I'm going to click on this plus sign to add a new node. I'm going to type in sprite, click on sprite, and press create. This will add a new sprite node to my scene tree, and as you can see, the sprite node has some extra properties. It inherits from the base node, canvas item, and the node 2D classes, but it also has its own properties. The one we're interested in right now is the texture property. We're going to look at our file system, find our icon.png, which is an icon, default icon Godot puts in every project. We're going to drag this to the texture property of the sprite class. That way, our sprite can display an image. And we can see our image inside the viewport. Now let's change some properties from the inspector to manipulate this sprite node. I'm going to go inside the transform property under the node 2D class. Make sure you have your sprite node selected inside the scene tab. Here we can set a different position. By default, it's located at 0, 0. Let's set its X to 100 and see what happens. As you can see, the node moved to the right by 100 pixels. We can also set things like rotation. Let's set it to 90, and we can also scale it on the X or the Y axes. I'm gonna set this one to 2. Okay, awesome. In this lecture, we learned about the scene tab, how we can add some nodes. We're gonna get into scenes and nodes in much more detail, but for now, this much is enough. We also learned about the inspector tab and how we can manage the properties of different nodes. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next lecture. And one quick note before we end this lesson, make sure to save your scene every time you make a change. And to save your scene, go to scene menu, click on save scene, or you can hit Ctrl S, which is much easier. I use the shortcut all the time. I never use this save scene option in the scene menu, but it's good to know that it's there. Ctrl S, save your scene, and you're good to go. Hi, in this lecture, we're gonna learn how to move around inside the viewport. Let's get started. Okay, let's first take a look at how to zoom in and how to zoom out. There are a couple of ways to do this. The first way, and the way I use 99% of the time, is just to use your scroll wheel. You can scroll up to zoom in and scroll down to zoom out. And this is basically all you need to know about zooming in and out, but I'm gonna show you some other ways nonetheless, just so you know. Well, first of all, let's take a look at this zooming section on the top left of your viewport. Here you have a plus button and you have a minus button. If you click on the plus button, you're gonna zoom in, minus, zoom out, very simple. If you want to reset your zoom to 100%, which is the default, you can press Ctrl 0 to reset it, and you can also use Ctrl plus and Ctrl minus to zoom in and zoom out. You might prefer that to your scroll wheel, depends on you. But like I said, I just use my scroll wheel and that's enough for me. Okay, next, let's learn about how to pan the viewport. Just like zooming, the way I do this is by clicking on my scroll wheel, holding and using my mouse to pan around. This is all you need to know. This is what I use most of the time. Click on the scroll wheel, hold, and just move your mouse to pan to a different location. You can even pan, like your mouse can go outside of your window viewport, but it's gonna teleport back to the other side, so you can just do stuff like this. You can keep scrolling. Yeah. Another way you can pan is by going inside the pan mode. You can do this by using the shortcut, which is G, or you can find this hand icon on the toolbar and click on this, and that way you don't need to use the scroll wheel. You can just use your left mouse button, click hold, and use your mouse to pan around. But make sure you go back to the select mode, which is the mouse icon here. You can click here, or you can press Q, which is the shortcut. Now finally, let's talk about how to move to a specific node. So let's say you're making a huge game, you have tons of nodes in your scene, and you need to find a specific node. I'm gonna pan to the left so that this sprite isn't visible anymore. And now I want to find this sprite, but I don't know where it is. So I can look inside my scene tab here, look to my scene tree, find the node, and then I can double click on the icon to the left of the node, and that will take me to that node. Double click and boom, Godot teleports me to the location of that node. But make sure you don't click on the name. In this case, the name is sprite. If you click on the name, double click on the name, Godot is going to assume that you're trying to rename the node, which is not what we're trying to do. See? Thinks I'm renaming the node. Okay, great. These are the very basic ways you can move around inside the viewport and find specific nodes. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. In this lecture, we're gonna take a look at some tools that we can use to manipulate nodes. Let's get started. Let's talk about the toolbar. Toolbar is located just above the viewport and has all sorts of useful tools that we can use. You have a different toolbar for 2D and 3D. So if I switch to the 3D workspace, you will see that some of the tools are different in between these. Now, right now we're using the select mode, and this is like the default mode that you're gonna use most of the time, but we have some other tools here that we can use as well. I'm gonna select my sprite node from the scene tab here, and while I'm at it, I'm gonna delete this node 2D because we don't need it anymore. Let's select our sprite, and I'm gonna zoom in a bit. Using the select mode, I can left click and hold the sprite and move it to a different location. I can also use these circles at the edges of the sprite to scale it. And I can also hold down Control and left click and move my mouse to rotate it. I can do all these things using the select mode, but there are also individual tools for these specific actions. Let's take a look at the move mode. We can use this by hitting W or clicking this icon here next to the select mode, and this will let us move the node that we have selected. I can left click and hold to anywhere on the screen, and the node that I have selected will be moved. This is not the case, I should tell you, with the select mode. With the select mode, I need to click on the node. If I click on somewhere else, I'm not going to be able to move it. But with the move mode, I can just click on anywhere. This is very useful when you have multiple nodes stacked on top of each other and you just want to select one from the scene tree and move it out of the way without having to click on it actually. Okay, let's take a look at the rotate mode. Inside this mode, I can left click, hold, and rotate my node. That's simple. Next, we have the scale mode, and just like its name, this tool lets me scale my node using these square arrow thingies. Just like that. You might have noticed that these tools correspond to the transform properties inside the inspector. You can either use these properties here and set very specific numbers to position or rotation or scale, or you can use these tools if you want to visually see and have like a more dynamic feeling when you're customizing the transform of your nodes. Awesome, those tools are very useful for moving your node, scaling your node, and rotating your node. I'm gonna reset all my transform properties. Every time you make a change to a property in the inspector, a white arrow will show up next to it. And if you click this arrow, it's gonna set its value to its default value. In this case, it's gonna set everything to 0 and scale to 1. Great, these are some useful tools that you can use to manipulate your nodes. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Hi everyone, in this lecture we're gonna take a look at the file system and the playtest buttons. Let's get started. The file system is located on the bottom left, and everything you have inside your project folder will be displayed here. Godot calls the project folder res so that it's easier to reference the files inside this folder. So you can right click on this res and do open in file manager. This will open up your project folder inside your system. As you can see, for me, it's inside this PC, SSD, projects, Godot, learning Godot. So the path for this node.tscn, for example, is gonna be, if I do right click properties, it's gonna be projects Godot, learning Godot / node.tscn. What if I took this learning Godot folder and put it inside a different location? Then this path to this file would be different. And inside of Godot, if I was referencing that file by that path, that's going to be invalid. But thankfully, Godot just calls it res, so even if I move this folder inside my system, path to this file is always going to be res / node.tscn. I hope that's not confusing. If it is, please just ask me a question. I'll be happy to explain this a bit more. So yeah, the file system displays the files inside your project folder. Now let's take a look at the playtest buttons. These are on the top right, and these let you run the game or run a specific scene. You can also do things like pausing the game and stopping the game. Let's take a look at the play button here. You can click here every time you want to run your game, or you can also hit F5, which is the shortcut. I'm going to click on this, and Godot is going to tell me no main scene has ever been defined, select one. So let's talk about the main scene. In Godot, a game is made out of scenes, and we need to specify a main scene so that Godot runs that scene when it's trying to launch the game. Think of a game that you like to play. When you launch it, you probably see a start menu. In that case, the start menu is the main scene. And from that scene, the player can maybe launch the game, start a new game, load up an existing save file. But we need to tell Godot, this is the scene that we want the player to see first. That's why we need a main scene. I'm gonna click here again, just so I see this dialog once more. I'm gonna click on select, and this will open up this pick a main scene window where I can set a main scene, but you don't have to do it this way. I'm gonna close this. You can also go to project settings, go to run, and there's a main scene property here. You can click on this folder icon here and select a main scene from here. Doesn't matter, depends on your preference. Now, if I run the game by clicking on the play button, Godot is gonna launch the game and load the main scene that we defined. In this case, it's the node scene. Awesome, let's close this. And now I'm actually gonna talk about these two buttons here, and to do that, you can see that by default they're grayed out, and that's because they're used to pause or run, to stop the game. I'm gonna run the game again so that they're not grayed out, and I'm gonna minimize the game. And from here, I can click on this stop button and that will stop the game. And the game window is gone. I'm gonna play the game again, and this pause button is used to pause the game. Well, right now we don't really have much going on inside our game, so pausing it isn't really gonna matter because it's only has like a part of a sprite in it anyway, but just keep in mind that this button is used to stop the game. You can also unpause it. Did I say stop the game? I meant pause the game. You can use it to pause or unpause the game, and this stop will quit the game. Okay, let's click on stop, and now let's talk about this play scene button. Now the play button is gonna run the main scene, even if you have a different scene selected. But the play scene button is gonna run the currently active scene. To demonstrate this, I'm gonna create a new scene. Let's first click on this plus icon here to add a new scene. Let's say that this is gonna be a 2D scene. I'm gonna rename it by double clicking on the name. Let's call this level 1. I'm gonna save it, Control S, save it inside my res folder. Awesome, I now have a new scene. So in total we have 2 scenes in our game. One called node, which is kind of confusing, and one called level 1. Right now I have level 1 selected, and I'm gonna add a new sprite node here just so I can differentiate between the 2 scenes. I'm gonna drag the icon.png, left click hold, drag, put this icon.png inside the texture property of the sprite. Make sure you have sprite selected. I'm gonna take the sprite, zoom out of it, and put it inside the center of the screen. Now I'm gonna go back to my node scene, and in here I'm gonna zoom out, and for this scene I'm gonna just move the sprite towards the top left, so that I know if I'm seeing the sprite on the top left, it's the main node scene, and if I see it on the center, it's the new scene that we created. Let's go back to level 1, and in here I'm gonna click on the play scene button, and Godot is gonna run this scene. The sprite is in the center, just like what I have inside my scene. That means we're running this scene instead of the main scene. I'm gonna quit this application, and I'm gonna, just to show you, press the play button while I have the level 1 selected, and this will run the main scene even though I have level 1 selected, and we know because the sprite is on the top left. Okay, these are the playtest buttons. We also learned about the file system. Thank you for watching, and let's move on to the next lecture. Hey, this lecture is about modifying the interface. We're gonna learn about resizing and moving the tabs to different locations and creating and saving our own layouts. Let's take a look. In Godot, there are these tabs on the left and the right side of the screen. Tabs like the scene tab, there's the import tab here, there's the file system tab. On the right side we have the inspector tab, and there's also a node tab. All these tabs are resizable. To resize them, just get your mouse on the edge of these tabs and you will see an arrow icon that points to left and right. And once you see this, you can just hold down left click and drag this tab in order to resize it. You can do the same on the left side here. And that's how you resize the tabs. Now let's talk about how to move them to a different location. Once you have a tab selected, let's look at the file system here. This is the only tab on the bottom left here, and there's an icon next to it. If I click on this triple dot icon here, it opens up a small dialog. And from here, I can pick a different location for this tab. Right now, it's on the bottom left. And I can see that here because this small box here is lighter than the other ones. And I can say that I want this to be at bottom right. And I will click here and it will go to the bottom right. Now, the box above the bottom right section here is lighter. So this is the way you move tabs around. I can put it on the top right. I can even put it on a separate section on the top right so that they're not inside the same container. I'm gonna move it back to bottom left because that's where I like it. And that's how you move around tabs inside the editor. Now, once you have a layout that you like, that you want to keep, you can, okay, first I'm gonna change the layout a bit. I'm gonna take the file system, put it next to the scene tab. So it's up there, and I'm gonna take the inspector and move it to bottom left. So I have this wacky layout that I'm gonna use, presumably. Now, if I close Godot and open it back up, this layout is going to be lost. But in order to save it, we can go to the editor menu up on the top left. And from here, we can go inside editor layout and save layout. We need to give a name to our layout. I'm going to call this my layout and click on save. Now that it's saved, I can always change things here. Let's say I'm gonna move the inspector to bottom right. Oh, I wanna go back to my layout. I can go to editor layout, and click on my layout, and it's back. The default is also here, so you can always go back to the default layout by clicking default. So don't worry if you mess things up and you want to go back to the default, it's fine. Awesome, this is how you can customize your editor interface to make it your own. I usually, like 95% of the time, I use the default layout because I like it. I think it fits Godot well. It fits my workload, the way I work. But I'm also thinking of starting to use a new layout, which I call tall. Here, which takes everything to the right side and it gives you this wide area that you can dedicate to your viewport. This is a layout I used to have in Unity. I actually still use it in Unity. So I'm thinking of maybe starting to use it in Godot as well. But for now, let's switch back to default and we'll carry on like this through the course. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Hi there! So this is the start of the nodes and scenes section. In this section, we're going to be diving deep into what nodes and scenes are, and we're going to really try to understand them. We're going to start by going over some slides, and I'm going to teach you exactly what nodes and scenes are in Godot. Then we're going to hop into the editor, and we're going to apply our knowledge. Let's get started. Welcome. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at nodes and scenes. So in Godot, a game is made out of scenes, and each scene is made out of nodes. Let's say we have a game. Inside the game, we have multiple different scenes, and each scene is made out of different nodes. You can think of a game as a collection of scenes, and you can think of a scene as a tree of nodes. When you start a game in Godot, the scene that's run first is the main scene. You can have as many scenes as you want in a game, but you need to have a main scene. And from there, you can load different scenes, you can switch between scenes. Godot gives you the ability to do whatever you want with scenes, basically. Let's say you made a game and you have a start menu and you decided that the first scene, the main scene, should be the start menu. And from the start menu, the player can go to the main game. And after playing for a while, you can switch the player to a win screen or a game over screen, which are also different scenes. And from here, for example, the game over menu, you can go back to the game scene if you want to replay, or you can go back to the start menu if you want to quit. These scenes, all of these scenes can also have different scenes inside of them. For example, the game scene can have a player scene in it. The player scene can have a weapon scene. The game scene can have an enemy scene for the player to fight. So it's all about taking ideas and turning them into different scenes. Now let's talk about nodes. Nodes are the fundamental building blocks of Godot. Different nodes have different properties. If you think of game development as cooking, for example, nodes are the ingredients you use to create a dish. Let's say that you're gonna make pasta with tomato sauce. To make pasta with tomato sauce, you need ingredients, right? You need to have pasta, obviously, you need to have water, you need salt, you need tomatoes, you need pepper, you need all these ingredients and you need to mix them together to create the dish that you want. Just like that, in Godot, we use different types of nodes to create more complex structures. In that sense, you can think of a node as an ingredient. And just like an ingredient by itself is useless, a tomato isn't the same thing as tomato sauce with pasta. And just like that, a single node isn't very useful to us. And that's why in Godot, a node can be added to another node as a child. And this creates a tree-like structure. We can see in the diagram here that we have a parent node, and this parent node has two children, and these children also have more children under them. This nature of nodes in Godot is a very powerful way of creating more complex structures. So here we have a player node, which is a kinematic body node, which is a physics node that we use in Godot. And this is the parent node that we have. And this node has 4 different children here. It has a timer node, it has a sprite node, it has a collision shape node, and it has an animation player node. The player node by itself is just a kinematic body. It doesn't have the functionality of a sprite, it doesn't have the functionality of an animation player. But when we combine them together like this, we can create a much more useful structure that we can use in our games. I should also say that the first node, so a scene is made out of nodes. So you can basically think of this node tree as a scene. The first node is the root node. And the root node doesn't need a parent. So every node that you add after the root node has to have a parent. In the case of the sprite, the parent is the player. In the case of the rectangle shape here, it has the collision shape as its parent, and the collision shape is the child of the player node. Everything goes back to the root node, and the root node doesn't need a parent. Now let's talk about scenes. A scene is a group of nodes that are organized in a tree fashion. I've included an image here. This is the scene of an enemy from a game that I made. It has a kinematic body as its root node, and it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 nodes under it as children. This is a typical scene that you're gonna have in your games. A scene will always have one root node and only one. In this case, it's this kinematic body node, which I named enemy. And you can think of the root node as like a manager node over everything that's under it. a scene can be saved to disk and loaded back. I can save this enemy scene and use it as many times as I want. For example, if I have a level in my game and in that level I need to have 100 different enemies, I can use this enemy scene to create 100 different copies. Well, I said different, but they're essentially the same scene, so they're gonna be identical. I can create 100 enemies using only this scene that I have that I saved to my disk. A scene can be instanced, and that's exactly what I just explained. We can create a scene tree like this one, save it to the disk, then we can use it to essentially create copies of this scene. In Godot, running a game means running a scene. You can have as many scenes as you want, but you at least need a single scene, and that scene has to be the main scene. So like I said before, a game is just a collection of different scenes, and everything starts from the main scene, and from there you can expand to different scenes. In that sense, Godot editor is basically a scene editor. Inside of Godot, you can create 2D, 3D, and user interface scenes. 2D and 3D are kind of self-explanatory, and user interface scenes are things like menus or heads-up displays in games. Things that display your health bar and show your inventory and stuff like that. Just like we have 2D, 3D, and user interface scenes, we have specific nodes for creating 2D, 3D, and user interfaces. So we have the spatial node as the most basic 3D node that you can have. We have the control node, which is the most basic user interface node that you can have. And we have the node 2D, which is the most basic 2D node that you can have. In this lecture, you learned about scenes and nodes. And in the next couple of lectures, we're going to take all this theory that we learned and apply it to real-life scenarios in the Godot editor. Thank you for watching, and let's move on to the next lecture. Hey there! In this lecture, we're going to practice creating a scene and adding some nodes to it. We're also going to be creating our first control node, and we're going to look at the label node, which is used to display text to the screen. Let's get started. Okay, we're back inside the editor. If you want to, you can create a new project. I'm just going to use our old one. Let's create a new scene by clicking this plus icon here. You can also go to the scene menu and hit new scene, but that's way too difficult. Just use this plus icon. This gives us an empty scene. From here, Godot gives us some shortcuts to quickly get a scene up and running. The 2D scene shortcut will give us a node 2D. 3D scene will give us a spatial node, and the user interface will give us a control node. As you know, these are the most basic nodes that we can have for 2D, 3D, and user interfaces. We can also click on Other Node to go to the list of every possible node inside of Godot. And from here we can choose a specific node that we want to have in our scene. Let's go ahead and click on User Interface to get a control node. The first node we added is the control node, and this is the root node of our scene. From now on, every node that we add will be the child of this node. Let's add one more node to our scene. Click on this plus icon, or you can use the shortcut, which is Ctrl A. Let's do a search for label. Label is also a control node. It's also a user interface node. We know that from the color, user interface nodes are green. And we also know that from the fact that it's displayed under the control node. Let's click on label and let's say create. This adds a new label node to our scene. By default, it's located on the top left. Let's take it by left clicking and holding and put it in the middle. To display text with the label, we need to fill its text property, which is located inside the inspector. I'm just going to type in hello world, which is a classic. And as you can see, we have hello world displayed inside our screen here. I should also say that this blue line, this blue rectangle, is the extent of your screen. This changes depending on your screen size, which you can adjust from the project settings. Now we have our label inside our scene. We gave it some text for it to display. Before we can run our scene, we need to save it. I'm gonna hit Ctrl S and I'm gonna save this under a new folder that I'm gonna call UI. Now to run this scene, let's go to the play scene shortcut here, the play scene button, I should say. And we have hello world displaying on our game screen. Awesome. This lecture was about practicing how to create a scene and taking a first look at control nodes. We added a root node to our scene, which is type control, and then we added a label node, which is the child of the root node. Then we learned about the text property of the label and how we can display text on our screen. Hi there, in this lecture we're gonna talk about the way nodes relate to one another in terms of their position. We're also gonna talk about the differences between a base node type and a node 2D type. There's a lot of useful information in this one, so make sure to watch it until the end. Let's get started. Let's start by creating a new scene. This is gonna be a 2D scene, so I'm gonna click on 2D scene here. And this is gonna give me a node 2D as my root node. Let's rename this to something that makes sense. I'm gonna call it parent-child demo. And let's save this scene under our res folder here. For 99% of the time, you're gonna have the same name for your scene file here, your .tscn file, as your root node. So if your root node is called player, you're gonna save it as player.tscn. If it is, in this case, parent-child demo, we're gonna save it as parent-child demo.tscn. Unless you're doing something different or you know what you're doing, just stick with the same name as your root node. Okay, so first I'm gonna talk about the differences between the node 2D node type and the base node type. As you remember from previous lectures, we also have a basic node type that is the most basic type that you can have. Let's take a look at the create a node, create new node dialog here. And from here I can see all the nodes inside Godot. I'm talking about this node here, the basic base node type. Okay, so I have a node 2D here inside my scene. I'm gonna select it, and once I do, you can see that inside my viewport, it's highlighted here. And I can see it. If you hover over this icon here, you can see that the name of the node is displayed to me. The reason I can see it inside my viewport here is because it has a transform. It has a position inside the game world. And I know that from the inspector. I can see inside the inspector that this node I have selected has a node 2D property. And inside the node 2D property, under the node 2D property, I should say, it has a transform. And this transform gives it a position inside the game world, a 2D position. Right now it's located at 0, 0 in both axes. Okay, so now let's add a base node to our scene and let's take a look at what's the difference between these two. I'm gonna click on this plus icon to create a new node. I'm gonna click on node and do create. When I added a node 2D, I could immediately see it inside my viewport. But right now, this new node I added, the base node, is nowhere to be found inside my viewport. And that's because it doesn't have a transform. If you click on it and take a look at the inspector, you can see that the only property it has is the base node type. And that one doesn't have a transform. And that's why I can't see this node inside the viewport, because it doesn't exist. It doesn't have a position inside the game world. I can have it inside my scene tree. I can use it to store other nodes under it as children. I can add a script to it, but I can't see it inside the viewport. And that's the main difference between a base node and a node 2D. I'm gonna delete this node for now. And now let's talk about the way nodes relate to each other in terms of their position. Let's add a couple of sprites to our scene to better understand this. We could also use node 2Ds, but sprites will be easier to understand. I'm gonna click on my root node and say add child node, and this is gonna be a sprite. I'm gonna do a quick search, find it here, and do create. I need to give my sprite a texture, so I'm gonna use the default icon.png file here that Godot provides. Click, hold, drag, put it inside the texture property here, and now I can see it inside my viewport. I'm gonna take it and place it here. Now we have a sprite here. It has a transform, and it's telling me where it's located inside the game world here. I can hold it and I can put it to a different location. It's very simple. It makes sense that I can just move it and the position is changed. Now I'm gonna add one more sprite to this scene, and this sprite is gonna be a child of this sprite node that I added earlier. And that's why I'm actually gonna rename this sprite. I'm gonna double click on the name here, and I'm gonna rename it to parent sprite. Now I'm gonna add one more sprite. Make sure you have this parent sprite selected. If you don't have anything selected, if you click on anywhere else, you can have nothing selected. And if you add a node like this right now, it's gonna add it as a child of the root node, which is not what we want right now. We want to add a child to the parent sprite node. I'm gonna select it, add a new node, and this is also going to be a sprite, create, and as you can see, I have a child sprite node under my parent sprite. I'm gonna rename this to child sprite. This one also needs a texture, so I'm also gonna give it this icon.png. You're probably thinking of where this new sprite we added, because when we added the parent sprite, it appeared up here at 0, 0. But right now, the child sprite is actually right on top of the parent sprite. And that's because the childs you add move relative to their parents. Let's click on this child here and move him to the side. And you can actually see that we have two sprites here. Okay, let me expand on what I just said. This child position is relative to its parent, and its parent in this case is this parent sprite. Take a look at what happens when I move the child sprite. It moves just like we would expect, right? But now, this is where it gets interesting. Take a look at what happens when I move the parent sprite. They both move, and that's because when you move a parent, the child is also affected. And that's because the child's position is relative to the parent. We can also try to move the root node, which is the parent-child demo. It's up here in the top left corner. Just click on this and move it and see what happens. Everything else moves that is under it. Hit Ctrl Z to undo. So I hope it's clear that when you move a parent, all the children will also move. And you can see that the child is relative to the parent from its position. Let's click on the child sprite here, and let's take a look at its transform. We can see that it's positioned at 114 and 0 on the Y, which doesn't really make sense because it's clearly, if you think of this origin as 0, 0, which it is, it clearly has a Y value that is not 0 compared to this 0, 0 here. But this transform position is actually relative to its parent. So let's set this to 0 again. And you can see that it goes back on top of the parent sprite. Because for the child, the position 0, 0 is actually right where the parent sprite is. I hope the way sprites are positioned is a bit more clear right now. I encourage you to open up Godot if you don't have it open yet and just start adding nodes to your scene and start experimenting. Use sprites like I do because it's going to be easier to see what you're doing, and just add more and more sprites and experiment with the way they move, the way they relate to each other. For example, we can add more sprites here. I'm going to click on this child sprite and I'm going to hit Ctrl D, which will duplicate this node. And now I have two children under the parent sprite. And if I move the parent sprite, they will all move. And I can add, like I said, more and more to this, do this, and it's going to give you a better understanding for sure. Now, finally, let's talk about the way these nodes get deleted from the scene. Just like when we move a parent node, the children get affected. When we delete a parent node, the children will also be deleted. For example, if I delete this child sprite 2 that I just added, it's not going to affect anything else because it's a child sprite. It doesn't have anything. It doesn't have a child under it. Now, right click, delete. It's gone, no problem. But now let's try deleting this parent sprite here. If I do that, the child in this case, will also be deleted. So be careful when you're deleting parent nodes. Know that everything under it will also get deleted. I'm gonna do Ctrl Z to get them back. Hit Ctrl S to save. And this is it for this lecture. We learned about the way nodes relate to each other in terms of positioning, and we also learned the differences between a base node type and a node 2D. So like I said, go ahead and start experimenting with these nodes and really get an understanding of how they work. Thank you for watching, and let's move on to the next lecture. Welcome. In this lecture, we're gonna learn about the draw order and the z-index. And as a bonus, we're also gonna take a look at how we can give a different color to our sprites here. Let's get started. Let's start by creating a new scene. This is going to be a 2D scene, and I'm gonna rename this to draw order demo. Let's save it under res. Okay, now we need to add some sprites. But before I get into the main section of this lecture, I want to teach you something about sprites. Let's give this sprite a texture. And now let's take a look at the visibility property under the canvas item class here. Under visibility, we have a modulate. And using this modulate, we can give this texture a different color. Click on this white area here, which will give you this color picker. And from here, we can give this texture a different color. I'm gonna set this one to red, and then I'm gonna rename it here to red. I'm gonna duplicate this by hitting Ctrl D, rename it to green, and set its modulate to a green color. And finally, I'm gonna duplicate this again and set its name to blue. Go to visibility, modulate, set it to a blue color. Awesome. Now we have 3 different sprites with 3 different colors. This lecture is about draw order. So what is draw order? It's the order nodes are drawn to the screen in Godot. The draw order is what determines which node will be drawn on top of others. And in Godot, the node that you have at the bottom will be displayed on top of everything else. So here we have blue under green and red, and that means I can take blue and I can put it on top of green, and it's going to be displayed on top of green. And I can do the same for red. I can put it on top of it and it's going to be displayed on top. This is also true for green. If I take green and put it on top of red, it's going to be displayed on top of it because on the scene hierarchy, it's under red. So in this case, red is the one at the very top if you don't count the root node. So it's going to be displayed under these nodes here. And just like that, green will also be displayed under blue. This is also the case if you have a node as a child. So let's take green from here. I'm gonna left click, hold, and by holding it, I can drop it on top of another node to make it a child of that node. So I'm gonna drop it on red here. And as you can see, it became a child of red. And for some reason, okay, this is also interesting. I should also teach you this. The color of green got really weird. And that's because when we use modulate, the children are also affected. Let's go to red and let's take a look at its modulate. So this red modulate is also affecting green. Let's reset it to white so that everything goes back to normal, but we don't have a color on red. Now let's set its self-modulate instead of modulate. Self-modulate is gonna set the color just like modulate, but it's not gonna interfere with the children. So this is a quick little tip if you're messing with modulate or self-modulate colors. Basically, it's very helpful to know that modulate will affect the children, but self-modulate won't. Okay, back to the real topic at hand here. So I have green as the child of red here. So it's gonna be displayed over red because it's under red on the scene tree, and blue will be displayed on top of both just like what we had before. So even if you have a child like this, it's the same behavior more or less. And red is, but yeah, in this case, when you try to move red, green is gonna move too. So yeah, but we learned that from the last lecture. Okay, cool. This is how things work by default. But there are ways we can change this draw order that Godot has, mainly using the Z index. I'm gonna take green again and I'm gonna drop it on the root node so that it's not a child of red anymore, and I'm gonna take it again and put it in between red and blue so that I have the same order as I had before. Let's click on red here and let's take a look at its Z index property inside the inspector. It's under node 2D here, just under transform. And this Z index is basically a way of saying, I want this node to be drawn at a different level than the other nodes. So right now, by default, we have Z index 0 here. And it's the same for green as well. Let's take a look at its Z index, it's 0. And let's take a look at blue too. It's 0. So they're all on the same level. You can think of a Z index as a level that they're drawn. If you increase it, it's going to be on a different level. And if you decrease it, it's going to be on a different level. But the higher the Z index is, the higher priority it's given by Godot. Let's try to understand this by setting red's Z index to 1. So before, with the default settings, red was drawn under everything else. But with Z index set to 1, let's see how it works. As you can see, right now, red is drawn on top of blue and green, even though it's above them on the scene hierarchy here. So green and blue will be displayed under red. So that's what Z index does. It's like a cool little way to change the order things are drawn. Okay, awesome. This lecture was about the draw order, the order nodes are drawn to the screen in Godot. We also learned about the modulate property here under the canvas item property. And finally, we learned about the Z index. Thank you very much for watching, and let's move on to the next lecture. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it and you want to learn more about Godot and game development, make sure to check out the full course, which is 5 hours long on Udemy, using the link in the description. Thanks again.